The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody, welcome to our webinar. Hopefully you can all hear me clearly, and if all is going well, then you can also see Ian's screen. If there are any problems, just drop a message on the chat and let me know. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this discussion on alarm enforcement. We have a good turnout as well. For those of you who may not know who Mac Solutions are, I'll just give you a quick introduction before we start the main webinar. So we are the creators of the ProcessVue Alarm Management Suite of software, which, according to a recent ARC study, is the most popular independent alarm management software as used in the European power generation market, something that we're quite proud of. We offer software services and training on our products and in alarm management as well, and we are based here in the UK. So joining me on the webinar is Ian Brown, and Ian's going to be taking me through, taking you through the main body of this presentation. So Ian has many years experience in the process industries in roles ranging from maintenance management, control system management and consultancy. His expertise covers alarm management standards and guidelines, and he is also a TUV certified engineer. And then there's myself, Jason Cook. Ian's clearing his throat there. So myself, having worked for iMac, I also worked for Matricon and Honeywell in their alarm management arena over the last 13 years, holding various different roles in technical support, site engineering, sales and marketing. And I'm now the ProcessVue product manager. So with that, I will hand you over to Ian, who will guide us through the main body of this presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, then you can key them into the interface on your screen. We will be having a question and answer session at the end, so either key them into your into the screen there, into the interface, or if you wait to the end, you can also raise your hand, and hopefully I will be able to unmute you and you'll be able to answer your question that way as well. Okay, over to you then, Ian.
Okay, thanks, Jason. First of all, apologies, everyone. I thought I'd muted my microphone when I cleared my throat before I got started, and something didn't work with my mute switch. So apologies for that. However, today's webinar, it's about alarm enforcement. And we're going to have a little look at what it actually is. What does it mean? What is alarm enforcement? And a personal view of, is it a good thing? Do we need it? Is it a bad thing? What should we do with it? Should we rush out and buy it, or should we push it away and say, not for me? So to do that, to give you a bit of an idea of the good, bad and ugly of alarm enforcement, I'm going to consider just a few minor points about why people will tell you you must have alarm enforcement and it's a good thing, and the counters against those points. And similarly, why people might tell you, oh, not for me, I wouldn't touch it at all, and counters against those arguments too. So let's crack on with the webinar. And first of all, I'm going to ask you, could you be certain that all your alarms and parameters on your control system are correct? They haven't been changed by anyone, they haven't been tampered with. When was the last time you checked that? How would you know? If you were asked the questions that are on the screen in front of you at the moment, how would you answer? Of course, as alarm management professionals, which I'm sure you all are, your answer would be, well, I can check against my master alarm database, but should you need to? This is where we're talking about alarm enforcement. Should you need to check against your master alarm database? And how would you do that? For example, if you have a master alarm database, you can export all the settings and give a nice spreadsheet to someone and say, I've exported this from my database, please go and check all the settings. It might take you a couple of weeks to go through a few thousand alarms, but okay, that's all sorted. Alarm enforcement, part of this is to get rid of all that nonsense. So let's have a look at alarm enforcement. What is it? It is the process of comparing the values, the parameters on your control system with, according to the standards, the authorized list of alarm attributes held within the site's master alarm database. And that process is also to restore the values which are found to be at variance with the values held in your master alarm database. So enforcement can do that check we just talked about a moment ago that you're going to give someone a couple of weeks to do. Enforcement is going to do that check for you and potentially restore all the values that are found to be wrong. So in the standards, alarm enforcement is an enhanced alarming technique, okay, that can verify and restore alarm attributes. So remember, enhanced alarming technique, that's what it's defined as in the standards. So alarm enforcement is the process of comparing between your master alarm database, your control system, finding any variances and fixing those variances, potentially automatically. Okay, so why would you have variances there? Why would there be a difference between what's in your master alarm database, which is of course the authorized list of parameters on your control system? Why would there be differences? Really, there are only two reasons for change. One, you've made some authorized modifications to the alarm system parameters in accordance with your master or your management of change procedure, and everything's going nicely. Parameters have been changed. Yes, they've been changed because we want them to change, so that they're good changes. The second type of change is unauthorized changes. Now, these may be changes made by operators or engineers with access to the system because they can, because they want to. They may be undocumented. So it could be as a result of internal tampering. It could, of course, be external intrusion. For example, a few years ago, Stuxnet, there was a Stuxnet thing which attacked some PLCs. Okay, so it could be external. The reason your parameters are not what you expect them to be is because they have been messed with. So those are really the two reasons why parameters would change. So alarm enforcement could put those parameters back to where you think they should be or where they should be. So let's consider, is alarm enforcement a requirement? Okay, no, it is not a requirement of alarm management. It is included as part of Section 12, and alarm enforcement is included in Section 12 of the standards, which are the detailed design, enhanced and advanced alarm methods. As I mentioned before, remember enhanced alarm methods. Section 12 of the standards, ISA 18.2 and IEC 62682, Section 12 is informative. It's not a normative section. It's not mandatory. And in the standard, it does say it provides guidance and consideration. It uses techniques not normally found in control systems. And you may need to add additional layers of programming or logic or modeling to modify those alarm attributes. Lots of things here that potentially your system does not have. The functionality does not exist in your systems. And this is why this Section 12, which includes alarm enforcement, is for guidance and consideration. Most systems won't have that functionality, so therefore it is not a requirement. In the EMUA guidelines, it says tools should be provided to audit the current alarm database, optionally to automatically reset unauthorized changes. So you have an option, it's a should, it's guidance. So alarm enforcement is not a requirement. But is it a good thing or a bad thing? We don't have to do it, as opposed to many things within the standards, 18.2 and 62682. Most of that is mandatory. If you wish to comply with the standards, you must follow all those clauses within the standards. Okay, so it's not a requirement. If we look at the requirements for an alarm philosophy from the standards, we can see that approved, enhanced and advanced alarming techniques, the top orange band there, is simply recommended. That's because it's not a requirement. However, if we look below at the bottom orange bar, it says alarm system audit is required. So on the previous slide, the EMIR guidelines suggested tools should be provided to audit and check your database, optionally to reset the parameters. Alarm system audit is a requirement. Okay. So what is in the standards? Remember, it's not a requirement. And in actual fact, the note I've put on the screen there, in ISA 18.2, the first edition, there was a note. This clause is informative and does not contain any mandatory requirements. That's actually been removed in the 2016 update, but the section itself has not changed, or very little change. So, okay. So in the standards, there is a suggestion, there is a recommendation that there should be a regular comparison of the rationalized values with the settings in effect in the control system. That's text taken from the standard. And yeah, agreed. Absolutely. You should regularly check to make sure that what's in your master alarm database is actually on your control system. You want to make sure your control system is working properly. So no problem with that. And this should be part of your auditing regime, which of course auditing is a requirement. However, it also says enforcement is the automatic verification and restoration of alarm attributes. Now, my personal note on that is I disagree with automatic restoration. I wouldn't want something, a third-party application, which most enforcement packages are likely to be. I wouldn't want something automatically forcing my values to be something that's in my master alarm database when I'm busy changing something in the process. So I'm not particularly keen on that, but that's what the standard says. So enforcement as well can be initiated on a scheduled basis, on request, and should differentiate results from state-based alarming or alarm shelving methodologies. So if you have a shelved alarm, you don't want your alarm enforcement package forcing your alarm to be back enabled again. You have different states of your plant. You may have a startup state where certain alarms are required, normal running where those alarms are not required. If you're in normal running, you don't want your enforcement package to force the alarm to be the alarm that's used in the startup or the shutdown phase. You want it to pick the right phases. So it has to do a lot of checks. So we can do this on a scheduled basis. For example, some people would suggest at the end of every shift, alarm enforcement is run. It will reset all parameters, and we'll come to that later on, that have been changed during the shift. Or it could be done at midnight, whenever. So how do we do alarm enforcement? How is it implemented? Okay, so we have a control system with a nice computer box there, we have an operator, and we have a process plant. First of all, we need a master alarm database. And we load all our configuration data into our master alarm database. Our master alarm database will also contain values for operator response, cause and consequence of alarms, all the ancillary information to document alarms. It will also contain that. Alarm enforcement, first part of enforcement, is to do a comparison. So from our master alarm database, we check what's in the control system. Are there any differences? If there are any differences, we force those changes. We make the control system use the values that we have authorized and approved in our master alarm database. And this, of course, can be done manually. It can be done automatically, depending how you set up your enforcement. So that's a very simple view of how alarm enforcement works. So are there any challenges? Okay, we're going to do all these things that we've just seen on the previous screen. Are there any challenges? Yes. Basically, alarm enforcement is likely to be a module or a functionality within your master alarm database, Or it may be another application that sits between your master alarm database and your control system. It's going to be separate because a lot of control systems out there, legacy systems, are unlikely to contain the functionality required to make alarm enforcement happen. And this is why enforcement is only informative and not normative. So it's going to be separate from your control system. So how are you going to connect? How will enforcement work? Especially with legacy systems that don't have an OPC connection. You can't connect directly to it. You may have to use a USB stick. Okay. Last 4 years ago, I worked on a system where we had to transfer data from a current alarm system, current control system that used floppy disks. So it's not necessarily going to be easy to run this every shift, every day. So there are some challenges there about how you connect. And then if you can connect permanently, will alarm enforcement run permanently? Or will it run on a scheduled basis? Will it run manually on demand? You have to ask it to run rather than it runs at the end of every shift or at midnight, or rather than it running permanently. Because if it runs permanently and you make a genuine change to your control system, will that genuine change be overwritten immediately because the alarm enforcement says so? So there are a few challenges there. And as I mentioned earlier, how will you differentiate plant states, recipes, batches, phases? How will those be identified by your alarm enforcement package? Quite a few things to think about, quite a few challenges for enforcement. So I'm saying there are a few challenges. So why do I need it? Just remind me why I want this. Why is this a good thing? Okay, because the salesman told me so. A lot of people, not just salesmen, but a lot of people will tell you this is what you need. You must have alarm enforcement. It's essential. It's a requirement of the standards, perhaps. Maybe they'll tell you that. It's in the standards, but it's not a requirement. I've got just the software product you need. It'll solve all the problems you have, even ones you didn't know you had. So maybe people are telling you all these good things about alarm enforcement and none of the negative things. Of course, there may be pessimists on your plant. Some of the engineers, alarm enforcement, no, I'm not going to use it. It's not for me. It's not for our plant. There are so many problems with alarm enforcement. There are so many things can go wrong. We do not want this. Are they right? Is the salesman right? It's up for you to decide. But to help you try and decide about whether you need alarm enforcement or not, what I'm going to do over the next 3 or 4 slides is pick a handful, four examples of the reasons why you should have alarm enforcement that people tell you, and counters to those, and 4 examples of why people, the pessimists, will say absolutely not, and counters to those, to give a balanced approach. So first of all, alarm enforcement, for and against. You may be told that different alarm settings may be required during plant startup, during normal running, when you change phases. Enforcement can update these values for you. You don't have to worry about it. It just happens. It's a good thing. Okay, against that, I would say, but the enforcement module has to detect all those plant states, and it has to be running permanently. Because if you move from startup to normal running at 3 o'clock in the morning, and your enforcement module is scheduled to run at midnight, it's already run. And now you've moved to a different phase, and your alarms don't get updated. Unless it's running automatically and will do this automatically at every instant. So it has to be running full time. So for me, changes from alarm state, from plant states, should be part of your control system configuration. It should be configured for this phase, this plant state, I need this alarm. For this one, I don't. So enforcement will help you put those things right, but it should be part of good programming skills and programming the way you configure your system. Again, with different recipes for a batch plant. Different recipes will have different parameters, temperatures, settings, pressures, for example. They may have different alarm requirements for different settings, for different batches. Enforcement can help you do that. Again, as with state-based enforcement, the alarm enforcement module must be running all the time, and it has to detect every single recipe. It has to detect every single batch phase as you go through. Is the alarm required? Is it not required? Again, it's going to have to be running permanently and permanently connected. And for many legacy systems, that's not an option. So, okay, what about if operators have made changes? Alarm enforcement will sort this out. If an operator finds an alarm that's a nuisance and he changes a setting, changes a value, if you allow that on your plant, when enforcement runs, maybe at the end of the shift, it'll put all those alarm settings back. Okay, that's a good thing, but for me and for most people, operators shouldn't be allowed to make alarm changes. It should go through the proper management of change process. When operators make changes to alarm settings, potentially they're doing it for an immediate fault, an immediate problem that they've identified. This is going off all the time, this alarm. I need to change the switch off, to change the setting of this alarm. I need to do this now because it's annoying me. They may not consider the risks associated with minimizing or taking that alarm away. So ideally, operators shouldn't be allowed. So although enforcement can do this, should you really need to? For me, no. Okay, overhaul enforcement. If you have a shutdown, or maybe you have a maintenance on your control system, you're putting in some project work, enforcement can quickly update all your master alarm database values once you start your plant up. Okay, again, should you really need that? Is that a requirement? Is it a necessity? Project and maintenance processes should have a commissioning phase. When you install or replace an instrument, you should be checking the range of the instrument, obviously, to make sure it's working correctly. As you check the range, you should be checking if any alarms are set. Have they been activated? Is the smart instrument, for example, with settings turned off, that should be turned on? So that should be done as part of commissioning. Again, with projects, commissioning should include a factory acceptance test, a site acceptance test. It should all be tested. You shouldn't need alarm enforcement to do that for you. It's bad practice if you're using alarm enforcement for that. So people will tell you some good things about the last 4 little points I've made there. This is why you need alarm enforcement. Really, those things you shouldn't need. Okay, so what about the pessimists amongst us? I'm on this side for the moment. Legacy systems. I've got my production manager coming to me. I need my enforcement module to do this work, and it's a legacy system. I've got to plug a USB stick in. When that happens, okay, it causes a reset of the control system when I re-download all these settings. You're not stopping my system. I've got production to make. No chance. That's why we can't use alarm enforcement on our plant, because we have to stop the process. We have to shut down to update that system. Not going to happen. Okay, the counter to that is actually, if you have a well-managed alarm system, the number of differences you find when you're checking and comparing between your master alarm database and your live system should be very small. You shouldn't need to plug a USB stick in. You shouldn't need to reset your control system and stop production, because this should only be 1 or 2, a handful of small changes, which once you've identified they are the changes that should be there, you can make those changes manually. You shouldn't need to stop that. So when people say you can't use it because, that's not quite correct. It shouldn't be a problem at all. What about validation issues? On pharmaceutical plants, for example, all your processes and procedures, you need to validate those things. You can't make change without validation. How does this affect this process? How does this affect that batch phase? You have to do a validation. So do I really want my alarm enforcement running permanently? And if a change is made for whatever reason on one particular part of the control system, my enforcement just bangs it back again without any validation, because that's what it says it should do. That's not good. No good for pharmaceutical plants then. Okay, countering that. Enforcement can be initiated manually. If we remember for an earlier slide, you can run this manually on demand. So part of enforcement is to do a comparison and identify the changes. So you run your comparison, which doesn't affect your plant, so it doesn't affect your validation. You run your comparison, you find the changes that have been made, the changes that you identify. Okay, we can now put those through our management of change process. We can validate those changes and then use enforcement to update them. So to say you can't use enforcement on a pharmaceutical plant, not quite correct. You can, as long as you have the process and procedures in place to use that. So that's not a reason not to use enforcement. Oh, alarm enforcement. How do I know that what's in my master alarm database will be updated correctly on my control system? We've got to rigorously test that the mapping from every parameter in the master database, alarm enables, alarm settings, all the parameters, how do I know they are absolutely correctly mapped to the same appropriate settings, the tag, the parameter? How do I know they're all mapped? There are thousands of settings. I don't have the time to check all this to prove that my alarm enforcement module works correctly. So no, it'll never work for me. Okay, if your alarm enforcement is part of your control system, that shouldn't be a problem. However, it's less easy to argue against this stance that you can't use it because you have to do all this checking if it's a third-party remote application, because you do have to prove and do some testing that whatever we have in our master alarm database updates the correct values. However, there are methods of working out that your master alarm database will give you the right results offline. You can do that offline and prove that all those things work without actually affecting your system. It's less easy to counter against this argument, but not impossible. And again, cybersecurity. Oh, you're not connecting an alarm enforcement, a remote package to my control system. No, I don't think so. I'm not having that. Why? Okay, effectively, if you have a master alarm database and an alarm enforcement module which is connected to your control system, you are effectively giving someone a perfect Trojan horse into your control system. You are giving your master alarm database, your alarm enforcement module, your application, you're granting it access to your control system. People trying to hack into control systems find it a little more difficult because they need to understand the control system. But a database, most people know how to hack into a database. So, okay, it's easy to hack a database. And if we change values in there, alarm enforcement will update those values to your control system and your plant comes out of control. So it's not for me. Okay, well, countering that, if you have your network security properly set up, and it's something you should be addressing, is cybersecurity on your control systems. If you have that set up properly, you limit or control access to your system if it's a legacy system through USB sticks, floppy disks, etc. As long as you take your cybersecurity precautions appropriately, it should not be an issue. Although you are giving your Trojan horse access to your control system through your master alarm database, if your master alarm database is appropriately constructed and has a tamper indication on it, for example, Mac Solutions ProcessVue Guardian has a digital signature within the master alarm database, and any changes to the tables that have been done by anyone outside the database will be recorded and flashed up to people and say, look, there's something wrong with your database. Don't trust this. You need to look at this. So as long as your system is set up that way, cybersecurity shouldn't be a problem. So briefly, just taking some pros and cons and counters to those. Hopefully, when people tell you you must have it because of this, well, maybe not so. When people tell you, no, absolutely not, don't employ this, well, that's not really correct either. So hopefully I'm giving you a pros and cons of whether alarm enforcement is good for you or not. Coming to that question, is alarm enforcement a good thing? I've looked at some pros and some cons and counted the arguments for each. So is it a good thing? Yes, but. Okay, it can be used to update parameters quickly and securely if you've done rationalization or modifications, for example. But we shouldn't really need to use it, but it can be used. It can be used to update parameters if you've maintained or repaired your PCS system, your control system, and somebody forgot to back it up. So the current values aren't the same as the backup values. Your master alarm database, when you load your control system configuration, your master alarm database will recognize, oh, there's a lot wrong there, and update it. Okay, yeah, that's potentially a good thing, but it just shows poor lack of control of your maintenance procedures. You should have an up-to-date backup. There should be no differences. You can reset parameters if unauthorized changes are detected. So if the operator makes changes, okay, but we shouldn't be letting the operator make changes. There shouldn't be any unauthorized changes. And of course, as I've just mentioned, for cybersecurity, you have to have confidence that your master alarm database has not been compromised. So yes, you can do these things, and for that, alarm enforcement can be a good thing. What about no? Is alarm enforcement a good thing? No, if you use alarm enforcement to clean up your system. You're allowing operators, and I'm not bashing operators here, engineers, process engineers, control system engineers, you're allowing those people to make changes to your control system. Some of them may not go through the management of change process because it's either non-existent, it's very poor, or they just believe they don't have to. They may scribble it down on a yellow post-it note. Oh, that's good enough for me. I've made those changes. With alarm enforcement, my authorized changes will be put back those unauthorized changes. They'll restore them. So if you're using it to do that, it's not a good thing, because what that means is you're hiding problems. You're allowing people to make unauthorized changes. You're not in control of your system. And if you're not in control of your system, effectively, you're condoning the possibility of harm to people, the environment, maybe damage to your reputation, asset damage, financial loss. You're condoning those things because you're not tackling the issues where unauthorized changes are happening. So if you're using alarm enforcement to say, it doesn't matter what anybody does, my enforcement module will put it right anyway, then it's not a good thing, because you're simply not in control of your plant and not managing your alarms appropriately. So can it be a good thing? Yes. Can it be a bad thing? Yes. So should we really need alarm enforcement? No. Alarm enforcement, for me, is no substitute to a robust system of governance and management of change. And management of change, you have to make sure it's strictly adhered to, that all your changes go through your master alarm database, and then they're implemented on your system. You validate the changes, and everything is good. So if you do that properly, and no one is allowed to make unauthorized changes, then do you really need enforcement? No. The comparison part of enforcement, where you compare your control system to your master alarm database, excellent. We can do that anytime we like. We can run it as many times as we like. That's good. But we shouldn't need to enforce change, because everything's working correctly. We have robust governance. We have a robust management of change process. No one makes unauthorized changes. So do we need the enforcement? No, because nothing will need enforcing. Okay, however, how many of the people listening, how many of you can tell me that you have genuinely resolved all the alarm management issues on your plant? Can you demonstrate that you've got everything under control, that everything is working perfectly? No unauthorized changes are being made. If you can't, but you're working to resolve those issues, you could use alarm enforcement to help you. Okay, I know that some changes are going to be made that shouldn't be made. Alarm enforcement will put them back until we've solved the reason why those changes are being made. Then I don't need it because everything's done correctly. So until you've sorted out, it may be something to consider enforcement, but really once you've got everything in control, you don't need the enforcement part. However, as I've just mentioned, the comparison functionality will be an excellent tool to use, because if we refer back to slide 1, slide 2, where the EMUR guidelines said you should provide tools to compare between your control system and your master alarm database, the comparison functionality of your enforcement module will be an excellent tool. Perhaps your master alarm database, like ProcessVue Guardian, already has a comparison tool. Okay, whichever, but the comparison tool helps you with your auditing. So do we really need alarm enforcement? We shouldn't. But is it a good thing? It can be, it may not be. So should I embrace alarm enforcement? You've told me it might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing. I shouldn't really need it, but perhaps I do. So should I go for it? Should I have it? Should I rush out and buy that module? Yes, but implement it for the right reasons, because you can implement it, because it has a useful functionality that you currently don't have, the comparison functionality. Not because you have to. I must have enforcement because I know so many things are happening on my plant that I'm not in control of. If I have enforcement, it'll solve my problems. Don't do it for that reason. Do it for the reason it's a useful tool to help you, not to cover up your problems. Make sure you control enforcement and don't let it control you. So, concluding, enforcement isn't a requirement of the standards. And effectively, if you have a well-run, well-managed alarm system, it's not actually an essential tool. Because everything's done correctly, there should be no differences between your master database and your control system. So it shouldn't be needed, shouldn't actually be needed. However, the comparison functionality, if you don't already have that, will help you with your auditing capabilities that you're developing for your systems. So you want to audit your alarm system, you want to compare your values, make sure all your parameters are correct. The comparison part of enforcement, if you don't already have a comparison module, excellent, that's useful. So should I use enforcement? Okay, yeah, but just make sure you do it for the right reasons.